75,000 years ago, in a cave in what is now northern Iraq, a Neanderthal man lived who should not have been alive. He was blind in one eye. His right arm had been severed below the elbow, possibly by a cave bear or a rockfall, and the bone had healed into a sealed stump. Both of his legs had been broken, leaving him with a painful limp. He was almost certainly deaf, and yet this man, this broken, battered man, survived into his 40s, an extraordinary age for a Neanderthal because the people around him refused to let him die. They fed him, they protected him, they kept him warm by their fire. They did this not for a day or a week, but for years, perhaps decades, until the very end of his life. And when he finally died, they did not drag his body to the mouth of the cave and leave it for the animals. They buried him. They laid him in the earth inside the cave where he had lived, and they may have placed flowers on his grave. This is the story of that man, and of the cave where he was found, and of the people who, 75,000 years before anyone had written a single word about love or kindness or duty, showed all three. It is a story that begins in the mountains of a region we now call Kurdistan, in the northern reaches of a country we now call Iraq, in a landscape of rolling hills and deep river valleys and towering peaks that has barely changed in 100,000 years. It is a story about bones and dirt and pollen, and the patient, meticulous work of scientists who spent decades piecing together a past that had been buried for longer than any of us can truly comprehend. But more than anything, it is a story about compassion, about the most ancient and enduring of all human qualities, the impulse to care for someone who cannot care for themselves, and the mystery of why that impulse exists at all. If you are new to this channel, welcome to the Calm Archive, where we tell the quieter stories of history, the ones that are easy to miss but impossible to forget. If these stories help you rest, you might consider subscribing, so that the next time you need a voice to carry you towards sleep, we will be here. There is no rush, just settle in and let us begin. Tonight, we are going to a place called Shanidar Cave. It sits high on the slopes of Brados Mountain, in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. The cave is enormous. Its mouth opens wide enough that you could fit a small building inside it, and the interior stretches back into the mountain like a vast, dim hall. The ceiling is high, perhaps 45 feet at its tallest point, and the walls curve inward as they rise, giving the space the feel of a natural cathedral. A river runs through the valley below, the Great Zab, one of the major tributaries of the Tigris, and from the mouth of the cave you can look out across a landscape of rolling hills and rocky slopes that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The air up there is clean and thin. In the spring, the hillsides turn green with new growth, and wildflowers bloom in the meadows between the rocks. In the winter, snow covers the higher peaks, and the wind comes down from the north carrying the kind of cold that reaches into your bones and stays there. It is a beautiful place, and a hard one. The interior of the cave itself is a remarkable space. Visitors who have entered it describe a sense of awe at its scale. The main chamber is roughly 50 meters wide and nearly 9 meters tall at its peak, large enough to comfortably shelter dozens of people and their fires. The floor is uneven, rising and falling in gentle slopes and terraces that would have provided natural divisions of space, areas for sleeping, for cooking, for tool-making, for storage. The walls are pale limestone, stained in places by centuries of wood smoke to a warm brownish hue. In the back of the cave, where the light from the entrance cannot reach, the darkness is total, a deep velvety blackness that seems to have a physical presence, like a wall you can almost touch. But near the entrance, especially in the morning and late afternoon when the sun is low, the light floods in and fills the space with a soft golden glow that is surprisingly warm and inviting. It is easy to see why the Neanderthals chose this place. It offered protection from the weather, from predators, and from the wind that howls through the mountain passes in winter. It was spacious enough for a large group to live in without feeling crowded. It was close to water, to hunting grounds, and to sources of the raw materials needed for tool-making. And it had something else, something less tangible, but no less real, a sense of permanence, of solidity, of being rooted in the earth in a way that an open-air camp could never match. The cave was home in the deeper sense of the word, a fixed place in a world of constant movement, a place you could leave and return to, a place that remembered you even when you were gone. The people who lived there, the ones we now call Neanderthals, or more formally Homo neanderthalensis, did not know they were Neanderthals. They did not know they were different from anyone else. They did not know that hundreds of thousands of years in the future, scientists would give them a name derived from a valley in Germany where the first of their kind was recognized. They simply lived. They hunted. They made tools. They gathered around fires in the long evenings and watched the light dance on the walls of their cave. They raised children and they buried their dead. And in doing these things, they left behind a record that would not be discovered for tens of thousands of years until a young archaeologist from New York made his way to that mountain in the early 1950s and began to dig. To understand Shanidar Cave, you need to understand the landscape that surrounds it, because the cave did not exist in isolation. It was part of a world, a complete ecosystem of mountains and valleys and rivers and plains that provided everything the Neanderthals needed to survive. The Zagros Mountains are one of the great mountain ranges of the Middle East, stretching in a long arc from southeastern Turkey through Iraq and into Iran, a distance of roughly 1,500 kilometers, running roughly parallel to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that would, tens of thousands of years later, give rise to the first civilizations of Mesopotamia, though that story was still impossibly far in the future. They are ancient mountains, formed by the collision of tectonic plates over millions of years, and they are made primarily of limestone, a sedimentary rock that is particularly prone to the formation of caves. This is because limestone dissolves slowly in water that contains carbonic acid, a mild acid that forms naturally when rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the slightly acidic water seeps through cracks and fissures in the limestone, dissolving the rock grain by grain, opening up channels and chambers and eventually creating the kinds of large, habitable caves that attracted human and pre-human occupation. Shanidar Cave was formed in exactly this way, carved out of the limestone of Brados Mountain by the patient, persistent work of water over geological time. The result was a cave of exceptional size and quality, a natural shelter that was dry, spacious, well ventilated, and positioned high enough on the mountainside to be safe from flooding. For the Neanderthals, it was an ideal home, and the archaeological evidence tells us that it was occupied, not continuously but repeatedly, over a period of at least 60,000 years, from roughly 100,000 years ago to roughly 40,000 years ago. Generations upon generations of Neanderthals were born in that cave, grew up in it, raised their own children in it, grew old in it, and were buried in it. The cave was more than a shelter. It was the centre of their world, the fixed point around which the rest of their lives revolved. The valley of the Great Zab, visible from the cave mouth, would have been a vital resource. Rivers are magnets for life. They provide drinking water for humans and animals alike. Their banks are lined with edible plants, reeds and sedges and water-loving herbs. They attract game animals, which come to drink and to graze on the lush vegetation that grows near the water. They provide a route of travel, a natural highway through the landscape that is easier to follow than the steep rocky mountain slopes on either side. The Great Zab is a substantial river, one of the major tributaries of the Tigris, and in Neanderthal times it would have been even larger and more powerful than it is today, swollen by the greater rainfall and snowmelt of the Ice Age climate. The fishing potential of the river is unclear, as we have relatively little evidence of Neanderthal fishing, but the river would certainly have attracted the animals that the Neanderthals hunted, and the valley floor would have been one of the richest areas for gathering plant foods. The mountains themselves were home to a remarkable diversity of animal life. Wild goats and sheep were abundant on the rocky slopes, their agility and sure-footedness making them challenging but rewarding prey. Red deer and fallow deer grazed in the valleys and on the lower slopes. Wild boar rooted through the undergrowth in the wooded areas. Wolves and foxes hunted in packs across the open ground. Bears, including possibly the cave bear, which was significantly larger than any modern bear, sheltered in caves during the winter months. Leopards, those silent, powerful cats that are the most adaptable of all the big predators, stalked the mountain forests and rocky outcrops. Eagles and vultures circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed slopes. It was a rich and dangerous world, a world of abundance and threat, and the Neanderthals of Shanidar lived in the midst of it, adapted to it, shaped by it, part of it in a way that we, who live in a world of cities and technology and artificial environments, can barely imagine. But what he would find beneath the floor of that cave would not merely add to our understanding of Neanderthals, It would force us to rethink everything we thought we knew about them, and in doing so, it would force us to rethink what we thought we knew about ourselves. Because the story buried in Shanidar Cave is not just a story about Neanderthals. It is a story about what it means to be human and about how old that meaning truly is. His name was Ralph Solecki, and in 1951 he was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York City. He was young, ambitious, and deeply interested in the people who had lived in the mountainous regions of the Middle East during the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, which stretches back more than 2 million years and encompasses the vast majority of the time that human-like creatures have existed on this planet. The region that is now Iraqi Kurdistan was, at that time, not a common destination for American archaeologists. Most of the attention in Paleolithic archaeology was directed toward Europe, toward the famous painted caves of France and Spain, where early humans had left stunning images of bison and horses and deer on the walls. Those caves, in places like Lascaux and Altamira, had captured the imagination of the world, and for many archaeologists, Europe was where the action was. But Solecki believed that the mountains of Kurdistan held secrets of their own. He had read reports of caves in the Zagros range that showed signs of ancient habitation, and he was drawn to a particular cave that local Kurdish people had known about for centuries, a cave that sat high on the slopes of Bradost Mountain, overlooking the valley of the Great Zab. The cave had a name. The locals called it Shanidar, and they sometimes used it for shelter during the harsh mountain winters, just as people had used it for shelter for 100,000 years. Goats grazed near its entrance. Shepherds slept inside it on cold nights. The floor was thick with the accumulated debris of centuries of human and animal habitation, layers of ash and bone and discarded tools and compacted earth. But no one had ever dug beneath that floor. No one had ever wondered in any systematic way what might be buried there. Solecki arrived in the summer of 1951 with a small team of workers, mostly local Kurdish men who knew the mountain and the cave well, and he began to excavate. The work was slow and painstaking. The cave floor was made up of layer after layer of sediment, each layer representing a different period of time, like the pages of a book stacked one on top of another. The deeper you dug, the further back in time you went. The upper layers contained evidence of relatively recent human habitation, pottery fragments and animal bones and the remains of cooking fires that dated back a few thousand years to the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age. Below that were layers associated with the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, and below that, deeper still, were the layers that Solecki was most interested in, the layers that dated back not thousands but tens of thousands of years, to the Middle Paleolithic, the time when Neanderthals had lived in this part of the world. And so he dug. The excavation continued over several seasons. Solecki would return to New York during the academic year, teach his classes at Columbia, plan the next season's work, write grant applications to fund the project, and then travel back to Kurdistan when the weather allowed, usually in the late spring or early summer. Each season, the trenches went a little deeper. Each season, the sediment grew older. Each season, new fragments of the past emerged from the earth. Stone tools and animal bones and bits of charcoal from ancient fires. And then, in the lower levels of the excavation, in sediment that was tens of thousands of years old, Solecki's team began to find bones. Not animal bones, though there were plenty of those. Human bones. Or rather bones that were almost human but not quite. Bones that were thicker, heavier, more robust than those of any modern person. Bones that belonged to Neanderthals. The first skeleton they found would turn out to be the most remarkable of all, but at the time, as Solecki and his workers carefully brushed the dirt from around those ancient bones, he did not yet know what he had. He did not yet know that this particular set of remains would tell a story so moving, so profoundly human, that it would be written about in newspapers and books and scientific journals for the next 70 years and counting. He simply knew that he had found something important, and he began to excavate it with extraordinary care, millimetre by millimetre, brushstroke by brushstroke, as the hot Kurdish sun beat down on the mountain and the wind carried dust across the cave floor. The process of excavation itself deserves a moment of our attention, because it tells us something about the commitment and patience that went into uncovering the story of Shanidar. Archaeological excavation is not treasure hunting. It is not the dramatic, swashbuckling adventure of the movies, where a hero brushes away a thin layer of sand and reveals a golden artifact gleaming in the torchlight. Real excavation is slow, methodical, exhausting, and often deeply frustrating work. Solecki and his team were working in a cave that was more than 1,300 meters above sea level, in a region with limited infrastructure, far from any major city, at a time when international travel was far more difficult and expensive than it is today. They had to transport all of their equipment, their shovels and trowels and brushes and screens and notebooks and cameras and measuring tools, up a mountain trail to the cave entrance. They had to hire and train local workers. They had to establish a camp near the cave and figure out the logistics of food, water and shelter for a team that sometimes numbered a dozen or more people. They had to contend with the weather, which in the Zagros Mountains can shift from mild to brutal with little warning. Summer days could be scorchingly hot, while nights were cold, and the rainy season turned the mountain trails into rivers of mud. The excavation itself required removing hundreds of cubic meters of sediment by hand, bucket by bucket, layer by layer. Every bucket of sediment had to be sifted through a screen to catch any small artifacts or bone fragments that might otherwise be missed. Every significant find had to be carefully recorded, its exact position in the trench noted on a grid and in a notebook, its depth below the surface measured and documented. Photographs had to be taken, sketches had to be drawn, samples had to be collected and labelled. The work was repetitive and demanding, and it went on for weeks at a time, day after day, in heat and dust, and the constant awareness that a single, careless blow of a trowel could destroy a find that had survived intact for 50,000 years. When Solecki's team began to encounter Neanderthal bones in the deeper layers, the pace slowed even further. Bone is fragile, especially bone that has been in the ground for tens of thousands of years. It becomes mineralized over time, but it can also become brittle and crumbly, and the slightest pressure can crack or shatter it. Excavating a skeleton from compacted sediment requires a combination of surgical precision and the patience of a saint. The bulk of the sediment is removed with trowels and picks, but as the excavator gets closer to the bone, the tools become smaller and more delicate, dental picks and wooden sticks and fine-tipped brushes that are used to sweep away the sediment grain by grain. A single skeleton can take weeks to excavate fully, and during that time the bones must be protected from the sun, from wind, from rain, and from the constant risk of accidental damage. Solecki and his team treated each skeleton they found with the same meticulous care, and the records they left behind, their field notes, their photographs, their measurements, are still used by researchers today. This painstaking methodology is what allowed Solecki to recognize the pattern of injuries in Shanidar 1, to understand that the bodies had been deliberately buried rather than simply abandoned, and to collect the soil samples that would later reveal the pollen evidence for the flower burial. Without that care, without that patience, the story of Shanidar might never have been told. The skeleton was designated Shanidar 1, following the standard archaeological practice of numbering finds in the order they are discovered, but Solecki and his team, who spent many weeks carefully removing the sediment from around those bones, who came to know the shape and the damage of that skeleton with an intimacy that only careful, painstaking work can produce, began to call him by a different name. They called him Nandy. The name was not scientific, it was affectionate, almost tender, the kind of name you give to someone you have come to care about, even if that someone has been dead for 50,000 years. And there was a reason for that affection, a reason that became clear only as more and more of the skeleton was revealed, and the full extent of this individual's injuries became apparent. Nandy had been broken, not in the way that bones sometimes break after death, when the weight of the earth above presses down over millennia and cracks and shatters what is buried beneath. Nandy had been broken during his life. His injuries were numerous and severe, and they told a story of suffering that is difficult to contemplate even now, tens of thousands of years after the pain itself has ended. Let us go through them one by one, because each injury adds to our understanding of this man and of the people who kept him alive. Let us begin with his skull. The left side of his face had been crushed. The orbit of his left eye, the bony socket that holds the eye in place, had been fractured and pushed inward by some tremendous force. This injury would have destroyed the eye itself. Nandy was blind on his left side, and the damage to the bone was old, fully healed, which means the injury had happened years or even decades before his death. He had lived most of his life seeing the world from only one eye, with his depth perception compromised and his field of vision permanently narrowed. But the damage to his skull did not stop there. The injury to the left side of his face was severe enough that it almost certainly affected his inner ear as well. The analysis of his remains, conducted years later by the paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkus of Washington University in St. Louis, concluded that Nandy was very likely deaf, or nearly so, on at least one side and possibly both. He could not see well, he could not hear, and that was only the beginning. His right arm was gone. Not broken, not damaged, not weakened, but gone. The arm had been severed, or had been so badly injured that it had to be removed, at a point just below the elbow. What remained was a stump, and the bone at the end of that stump had healed over, forming a smooth, rounded cap of bone that showed clear evidence of having been a completed wound for many years. The nature of this injury has been debated. Some researchers believe the arm was lost to trauma, perhaps a crushing blow from a rockfall or a cave-in, or the bite of a large predator such as a cave bear or a leopard. Others have suggested that the arm was so badly damaged that it had to be deliberately amputated, which would imply a level of surgical knowledge that we do not usually associate with Neanderthals. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Nandy had lived without his right arm for a long time, probably for most of his adult life. He had adapted to its absence as best he could, but he could not have adapted alone. Both of his legs had been broken at some point during his life, and they had healed crookedly, leaving him with a pronounced limp that would have made walking difficult and running virtually impossible. His right foot showed evidence of a healed fracture as well. Taken together, these injuries paint a picture of a man who was, in the most literal sense, barely able to function in the physically demanding world of a Neanderthal hunter-gatherer. He could not see properly. He could not hear. He had only one arm. He could barely walk without pain. And yet, and this is the fact that changes everything, he was not young when he died. He was old. He was somewhere in his 40s, which for a Neanderthal was an extraordinary age, equivalent perhaps to 70 or 80 in our terms. Most Neanderthals did not live that long. The physical demands of their lifestyle, the constant risk of injury, the ever-present threat of infection in a world without medicine, all of these things conspired to keep Neanderthal lifespans short. Many died in their 20s or 30s. For Nandy to have survived into his 40s, carrying the burden of all those injuries, was remarkable. It was, in fact, impossible unless someone was helping him. But here is the question that stopped Solecki and his colleagues in their tracks, and that has stopped everyone who has studied this skeleton in the decades since. Why? Why would they do this? Why would a group of people already struggling to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth spend their limited energy and resources keeping alive someone who could not hunt, could not fight, could not gather food, could not even walk without difficulty? What was in it for them? And what does the answer to that question tell us about who the Neanderthals really were? Think about what it meant to be a Neanderthal. There were no hospitals, there were no doctors, there were no medicines in the way we understand them, no antibiotics, no painkillers, no splints or bandages or surgical tools. Life was physical in a way that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. Every meal had to be hunted or gathered by hand. Every night brought the risk of predators. Every winter brought cold that could kill. Every injury was potentially fatal, because even a simple infection could become a death sentence. And into this world, into this relentless, unforgiving world, place a man who was blind in one eye, deaf in both ears, and missing his right arm. Place a man whose legs had both been broken and had healed crookedly, leaving him with a limp that would have made it impossible to run from danger. This man could not hunt. He could not chase down a wounded animal or throw a spear or even hold a piece of meat steady while he cut it, because he had only one arm and his remaining hand would have been needed to hold the knife. He could not defend himself against a predator because he could not see it coming from his blind side and could not hear it approaching from any direction. He was, in purely practical terms, a burden on the group. He consumed food that others had worked hard to obtain. He required protection that others had to provide. And yet he lived. He lived for years. He lived for decades. He lived into old age. He lived because someone, or rather many someones over many years, took care of him. They fed him. When the hunters returned to the cave with meat from a successful hunt, they shared it with him. When the gatherers brought back roots and tubers and berries, they set aside a portion for the old man who could not gather for himself. When the nights grew cold and the fire burned low, they made sure he was near the warmth. When the group moved, as they must have done from time to time, following the seasonal migration of herds or seeking better foraging grounds, or simply moving to a new camp because the old one had become too dirty or too depleted, they waited for him. They slowed their pace. They did not leave him behind. This is not speculation. This is not romantic imagination imposed upon the evidence by well-meaning scientists. This is what the bones themselves tell us as surely as if Nandy had written it down. The bones tell us that his injuries were old and well healed, meaning he survived for many years after sustaining them. The bones tell us that he was reasonably well nourished at the time of his death, meaning he was being fed regularly. The bones tell us that he did not die of starvation or neglect or exposure. He died because he was old, very old for a Neanderthal, and his worn and damaged body simply gave out. But it gave out in a place of safety, inside the cave, surrounded by the people who had kept him alive for all those years. And when it was over, when the last breath had left him, they buried him. They did not throw his body away. They did not leave it for scavengers. They placed him in the earth, inside the cave where he had lived, and they covered him with soil. Whatever else we may debate about the Neanderthals, whatever questions remain unanswered about their language or their cognition or their culture, this much is beyond dispute. They cared for their own, and they honoured their dead. Imagine it. Let yourself see it if you can, because I think the imagining is important. Imagine the cave on a winter evening 75,000 years ago. The fire is burning near the entrance, the smoke rising toward the high ceiling and drifting out into the cold night air. The flames cast long, shifting shadows on the cave walls, and the light reaches far enough into the interior to warm the space where the group has gathered. There are perhaps 15 or 20 of them, maybe more. They are not tall by our standards. The men are perhaps 5 feet 6 inches, the women a little shorter, but they are powerfully built, with broad chests and thick, muscular limbs, and hands that are wider and stronger than ours, hands that were shaped by evolution for gripping and pulling and tearing with a strength that few modern humans could match. They wear animal hides and furs because the mountains are cold and the winters are long. The hides are roughly prepared, scraped clean of flesh with stone tools and perhaps softened by chewing, a technique that we know was used by Neanderthals because the wear patterns on their teeth show it. Some of the hides are stitched together with sinew or thin strips of leather, not with the precision of modern sewing, but well enough to hold the pieces together and keep the cold out. And there, near the fire, sitting on a flat stone or a pile of furs, is Nandy. He is old, and you can see it in every line of his body. His hair, if Neanderthals had the kind of hair that turned grey with age, and there is reason to think they did, is white or silver. His face is deeply lined. His one remaining eye is cloudy and dim. His right arm ends in a smooth, rounded stump that he has learned over many years to use as a kind of blunt tool, pressing it against things to hold them steady while his left hand works. His legs are folded beneath him at an angle that looks uncomfortable, because they never healed quite straight after they were broken. And someone brings him food. Perhaps it is a woman, a daughter, or a niece, or simply a member of the group who has taken on the task of looking after the old man. Perhaps it is one of the younger men, returning from a hunt with a piece of meat that has been roughly cooked over the fire. Whoever it is, they bring the food to Nandy because he cannot easily get it himself, and they do this with the ease of long practice, the kind of gesture that has been repeated so many times it no longer requires thought. It is simply what they do. It is what they have always done, for as long as anyone in the group can remember. Nandy has been here longer than most of them have been alive. He has been a presence by this fire since before some of the younger members of the group were born. He is part of the landscape of their lives, as familiar and as necessary as the cave itself. He is one of them, and they take care of their own. Let me try to walk you through what a year might have looked like for the people of Shanidar Cave, because understanding the rhythm of the seasons helps us appreciate how deeply woven into that rhythm the care of Nandy must have been. Spring would have been a time of renewal and relative abundance. As the snow retreated up the slopes of Bradust Mountain, and the days grew longer and warmer, the landscape would have come alive with new growth. The first green shoots would have appeared in the meadows and on the hillsides, and with them would have come the animals, the ibex and wild sheep returning to the higher pastures after spending the winter in the sheltered valleys below. The group would have emerged from the relative torpor of winter with a surge of energy and purpose. The hunters would have gone out more frequently, tracking the herds as they moved up the mountain, looking for young or weak animals that could be taken with the least risk. The gatherers would have begun their rounds of the familiar places where edible plants grew, checking the spots where wild onions emerged earliest, where the first berries appeared, where the roots of certain plants grew fattest in the still moist soil. For Nandy, spring might have meant sitting at the cave entrance in the warm sunlight, feeling the breeze on his skin after months of cold, hearing, if he could hear anything at all, the birdsong that filled the mountain air. Summer would have been the busiest season, the time of greatest activity and greatest abundance. The days were long and there was much to do. Meat had to be hunted and processed, dried and smoked for storage if the group had the technology for it, which some researchers believe Neanderthals did. Plant foods had to be gathered at their peak, because many plants are edible only during a narrow window of ripeness. Hides had to be prepared for the coming winter, scraped and softened and stitched into garments that would keep the cold at bay. Tools had to be made and repaired, flint cores had to be collected from the places where good stone could be found, and spear shafts had to be cut and shaped from straight-grained wood. The cave itself would have needed maintenance, the fire pit cleaned out, the sleeping areas tidied, the refuse of daily life removed and dumped outside. Everyone would have had work to do, and the work would have been hard and physical and unrelenting. Everyone, that is, except Nandy. He could contribute only in limited ways, perhaps sorting nuts or berries with his one hand, perhaps watching the children while the adults were occupied. But his presence was not resented as far as we can tell, because his care was not an interruption of the group's routine but a part of it. Autumn would have been a time of preparation and anxiety. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder, and everyone in the group would have been aware, in that deep instinctive way that people who live close to the land are always aware, that winter was coming and that winter could kill. The gathering of food would have intensified as the group tried to lay in stores for the lean months ahead. Nuts would have been collected and cached, dried meat would have been stored in the driest parts of the cave, and the group would have spent time preparing their winter clothing, patching worn garments and making new ones from the hides of the autumn hunts. The last hunts of the season would have been particularly important, because a successful late autumn hunt could mean the difference between a winter of adequacy and a winter of hunger. And then winter itself, the hardest time, the season that tested the group's cohesion and commitment to its limits. The cold would have been deep and persistent, and the snow on the higher slopes would have made travel difficult and hunting dangerous. The group would have spent more time in the cave, huddled around the fire, conserving energy, eating from their stores, waiting for the weather to break. These would have been the long, quiet days and the even longer nights, the times when the group was thrown together in the closest proximity, when minor irritations could escalate into serious conflicts, and when the bonds of affection and loyalty that held the group together were most severely tested. And through all of this, through the abundance of summer and the scarcity of winter, through the busyness of harvest time and the idleness of the cold months, Nandy was there, a constant presence, a reminder perhaps of the group's commitment to its values, of the unspoken promise that no one would be left behind. Now, I want to pause here and spend some time talking about what this means in a larger context, because it is easy to hear a story like this and to think, well, of course they took care of him, of course they did. That is what people do. But the truth is that for most of the 20th century, the scientific establishment did not believe that Neanderthals were capable of this kind of behaviour. The image of the Neanderthal that dominated scientific thinking for decades was that of a brute, a dim-witted, shambling creature that was little more than an upright ape, capable of basic survival behaviours but utterly lacking in the higher cognitive and emotional capacities that we associate with true humanity. The word Neanderthal itself had become an insult. To call someone a Neanderthal was to call them stupid, primitive, incapable of complex thought or feeling or empathy. This degrading image had its origins in the very first Neanderthal skeleton that was studied scientifically in a comprehensive way. In 1908, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was discovered at a site called La Chapelle-aux-Saints in the Corrèze region of south-central France. The skeleton was that of an old man, and he became known simply as the Old Man of La Chapelle. He was studied by a prominent French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule, who published a detailed, lavishly illustrated analysis of the bones over a period of several years. Boule's analysis was enormously influential in shaping public and scientific perception of Neanderthals, and it was also deeply, profoundly wrong. Boule described the Old Man of La Chapelle as a stooped, bent-kneed, ape-like creature with a jutting jaw, a receding forehead, and a dull, vacant expression. He positioned the head forward on the neck as though the creature could not hold its head upright. He depicted it as walking with a shuffling, bent-over gait, its knees perpetually flexed, its spine curved forward, its arms hanging loosely at its sides. The image was vivid, almost cartoonish, and it stuck in the public consciousness with the tenacity of a fairy tale. For decades, this was what people saw when they closed their eyes and thought of Neanderthals. It was not until much later, in the 1950s and 60s, that other scientists re-examined Boule's work and realized that many of his conclusions were simply wrong. The old man of La Chapelle had suffered from severe osteoarthritis and possibly other degenerative conditions, which explained the curvature of his spine and the awkward positioning of his joints. A healthy Neanderthal would have stood upright, walked with a normal gait, and looked, from a distance at least, not so very different from a stocky modern human. But the damage to the Neanderthal's reputation had been done. The image of the brutish, stupid, emotionally blank Neanderthal was fixed in the public imagination like a stain, and it would take discoveries like the ones at Shanidar Cave to begin, slowly and painstakingly, to wash it out. The old man of La Chapelle, incidentally, was himself evidence of Neanderthal care, though Boule did not recognise this. The old man had lost most of his teeth before death, and his jawbone had partially reabsorbed, meaning he would have had great difficulty chewing solid food. Some researchers have suggested that he, like Nandy, was fed by other members of his group, perhaps given food that had been pre-chewed or cooked until it was soft enough for his toothless gums. His burial, too, appeared to be deliberate, the body placed in a shallow pit in the floor of a small cave. But Boule was too committed to his vision of the brutish Neanderthal to see what was right in front of him. He saw the bones, but he did not see the story they were telling. But Shanidar I, Nandy, was not the only skeleton in the cave. Not by a long way. Over the course of his excavations, which continued intermittently from 1951 to 1960, Solecki and his team would eventually find the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals, buried at various depths and in various states of preservation. Each of them had a story to tell, and together they painted a picture of Neanderthal life that was richer, more complex and more deeply human than anything that had been imagined before. Let us talk about some of the others, because the story of Shanidar is not just the story of one man, it is the story of a community. Shanidar III was an adult male, and his story is different from Nandy's. Where Nandy's is a story of survival against extraordinary odds, Shanidar III's is a story of violence, of the sudden intrusion of danger into the daily life of these people. When Shanidar III's ribs were examined by researchers, they found something startling. His left 9th rib bore a wound, not a break from a fall or a fracture from a blow, but a deep, narrow, penetrating cut that had been made by something sharp and pointed. The shape and angle of the wound were consistent with a projectile weapon, a spear or a pointed stick that had been thrown or thrust into his side with considerable force. The point had entered between the ribs and had penetrated deep enough to nick the bone. This was not an accident. Someone or something had tried to kill Shanidar III. The wound had partially healed, which tells us two important things. First, Shanidar III survived the initial injury. He did not die on the spot. He lived for days, or more likely weeks after being struck. Someone tended to his wound. Someone kept him warm and fed while his body tried to repair the damage. Second, the healing was incomplete, which means he eventually died, probably from infection, the inevitable consequence of a deep puncture wound in a world without antiseptics or antibiotics. The infection would have been slow and agonizing, a gradual poisoning of the blood that would have brought fever and delirium and eventually death. The question of who or what inflicted this wound has been debated for decades. Some researchers believe it was the result of a conflict with another Neanderthal group, evidence of intergroup violence, the ancient precursor of warfare. Others have suggested it might have been an accident during a hunt, a misdirected spear throw by a companion. Still others have pointed out that the wound could have been inflicted by a modern human, Homo sapiens, because we know that modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in parts of the Middle East during this period, and their interactions were not always peaceful. Whatever the cause, the wound itself is significant because it tells us something important about the world these people lived in. It was a dangerous world. Violence was a real and present danger. Injuries were common, and death from those injuries was even more common. And this makes the story of Nandy's decades-long survival all the more remarkable, because it means that the people who devoted their time and energy and food to keeping the old blind one-armed man alive were not living in some pastoral paradise where resources were abundant and dangers were few. They were living in a world where a spear could come out of the darkness and pierce your side, where a cave bear could appear without warning, where a broken leg could be a death sentence. And yet they chose, despite all of that risk and scarcity, to keep Nandy alive. Shanidar 5 was another adult male, and he too bore the marks of injury and survival. His scalp had been wounded, cut, or struck with enough force to leave a permanent mark on the bone of his skull. The wound was a long, linear cut that ran across the top of his head, and it had healed completely, which tells us that someone had tended to it, had cleaned it, or covered it, or at the very least had watched over him while his body repaired itself. Head wounds bleed profusely, and in a world without the concept of first aid, a deep scalp wound could easily have been fatal, not from the wound itself but from the blood loss and infection that would follow. That Shanidar 5 survived tells us that the people around him acted quickly and effectively to help him. Do you see the pattern that is emerging? Each of these skeletons tells the same fundamental story in a slightly different way. Shanidar 1 tells us about long-term sustained care for a severely disabled individual. Shanidar 3 tells us about acute care for a life-threatening wound. Shanidar 5 tells us about treatment of a serious but survivable injury. Together, they tell us that when a member of the Shanidar community was hurt, the community responded. They did not abandon their injured. They did not leave them to die. They did not calculate the cost of care and decide that the injured person was not worth the investment. They helped. They healed. They carried their wounded literally and figuratively until those wounded could walk again, or, in Nandy's case, for the rest of his life. Let me take you forward now. Forward in time from the ancient cave to the modern laboratory, because there is another part of this story that we have not yet reached, and it is perhaps the most famous and most debated part of all. It concerns the skeleton designated Shanidar 4, and it concerns flowers. Shanidar 4 was an adult male, estimated to have been between 30 and 45 years old at the time of his death. He was found in the cave buried in what appeared to be a deliberately dug grave, his body placed in a curled fetal position, as though he had been laid down on his side and his knees had been drawn up toward his chest, like a person sleeping or like a child in the womb. That positioning alone was significant because it suggested that the Neanderthals of Shanidar were not simply discarding their dead in whatever position they happened to fall. They were arranging the bodies with care and intention, placing them in the earth in a way that spoke of thought, of ritual, perhaps even of belief. But the truly extraordinary discovery associated with Shanidar 4 came not from the bones themselves, but from the soil that surrounded them. When Solecki's team excavated the area around Shanidar 4, they collected soil samples, as archaeologists routinely do, in order to preserve as much information as possible about the context of the burial. These samples were carefully bagged, labelled, and sent to various laboratories for analysis, and for several years they sat in storage, waiting their turn to be examined. It was not until 1968, 8 years after the excavation itself, that a French palynologist named Arlette Leroy-Gourhan finally examined the Shanidar 4 soil samples under a powerful microscope. Palynology is the study of pollen and spores, those microscopic grains that plants release into the air in order to reproduce. Pollen is virtually indestructible. It can survive in the soil for thousands, even millions of years, and under a microscope each species of plant produces pollen with a distinctive shape and pattern that allows it to be identified. Leroy-Gourhan was one of the leading palynologists in the world, and she had extensive experience analysing pollen from archaeological sites. What she found in the soil around Shanidar 4 left her astonished. The samples contained dense clusters of pollen, not the kind of scattered, wind-blown pollen that you would normally expect to find in a cave, where the constant draft carries in tiny amounts of pollen from the outside world and deposits it in a thin, even layer across the floor. What Leroy-Gourhan found were thick, concentrated clumps of pollen, the kind of dense clusters that could only have come from whole flowers, flowers that had been placed in the cave deliberately, and had then decayed, leaving behind nothing but their pollen. And these were not just any flowers. The pollen came from several different species, including yarrow, cornflower, bachelor's button, hollyhock, grape hyacinth, and woody horsetail. This was a remarkable list, and it became even more remarkable when Leroy-Gourhan and other researchers began to investigate the properties of these plants. Several of them have known medicinal properties that have been recognized by traditional healers across the Middle East for thousands of years. Yarrow has been used since antiquity as a treatment for wounds and fevers. It has anti-inflammatory and antiseptic properties, and it can help to stop bleeding. Cornflower has been used as an anti-inflammatory and as a treatment for eye infections. Grape hyacinth has been used in traditional medicine across the region for various ailments. The implication was staggering, and Leroy Goran was not shy about stating it plainly. Someone, 50,000 years ago, had gathered flowers and placed them in the grave of the dead man. Not randomly, not carelessly, but deliberately, choosing specific plants, some of which had known healing properties. This was not the behaviour of a brute or an unthinking animal. This was ritual. This was ceremony. This was a symbolic act performed in the context of death and mourning. This was, in every meaningful sense, human. Solecki was deeply moved by Leroy Goran's findings. He had already come to believe, based on the evidence of Nandy's care and the deliberate positioning of the bodies, that the Neanderthals of Shanidar were far more complex and emotionally sophisticated than the prevailing scientific view suggested. The flower burial confirmed his intuition and gave him the evidence he needed to make his case to the world. He wrote a book about the Shanidar discoveries, and he gave it a title that was both a summary and a provocation. He called the book Shanidar, the First Flower People. The title was deliberately provocative, and Solecki knew it. By calling the Neanderthals flower people, he was challenging the entire edifice of assumption and prejudice that had been built around these ancient humans. He was saying, in effect, look at this. Look at what they did. These were not mindless brutes. These were people who buried their dead with flowers. These were people who chose plants with medicinal properties and placed them around the body of someone they had lost. These were people who, in every meaningful sense of the word, loved. The discovery made headlines around the world. It was written about in newspapers, discussed on television, featured in documentaries. It became one of the most famous archaeological findings of the 20th century, as recognizable in its way as the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb or the cave paintings of Lascaux. And for many people, scientists and lay people alike, it changed the way they thought about Neanderthals forever. The brutish, stupid, emotionally vacant creature of Boule's imagination began to fade, replaced by something more nuanced, more complex, more recognizably human. But science does not stand still, and the beautiful stories it tells are always subject to revision, because that is the nature of science: to test, to question, to probe for weaknesses, to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads away from a conclusion we find comforting or beautiful. And in the decades since Leroy Goran's analysis, the flower burial has become the subject of intense and sometimes fierce debate. Not everyone is convinced that the pollen clumps found around Shanidar 4 were placed there by Neanderthal mourners. There are other possible explanations, and some of them are quite persuasive. The most significant challenge to the flower burial theory came from an observation about the caves of the Zagros Mountains and the creatures that live in them. The caves in this region are home to a small rodent called Merionus persicus, the Persian gird, a relative of the gerbil. This animal is a burrowing creature, and it has a well-documented habit of collecting plant material, including flowers, seeds, and leaves, and storing them in underground tunnels and chambers. The gird is an industrious little animal, and its burrows can be quite extensive, running through the sediment in all directions. It is entirely possible, the skeptics argued, that the pollen clumps found near Shanidar 4 were not placed there by grieving Neanderthals, but were instead the remains of a gird's food cache, deposited in a burrow that happened to run through the same layer of sediment as the Neanderthal burial. The pollen would have survived long after the flowers themselves had decayed, and the burrow had collapsed, leaving behind dense clusters of grains that could easily be mistaken for evidence of deliberate flower placement. There was also the question of bees. Some species of ground-nesting bees create burrows in the soil and line them with pollen, which they use to feed their larvae. If bees had burrowed into the sediment near Shanidar 4 at some point during the thousands of years between the burial and the modern excavation, their pollen stores could have contaminated the soil samples, creating concentrations of pollen that had nothing to do with Neanderthal behaviour. A comprehensive study published in 2023, led by Chris Hunt of Liverpool John Moores University, provided further evidence for the sceptical interpretation. Hunt and his team conducted a detailed reanalysis of the pollen evidence from Shanidar Cave, using modern microscopy techniques and statistical methods that were not available in Leroy Goran's time. They concluded that at least some of the pollen clumps found near Shanidar 4 were consistent with bee or insect activity, rather than deliberate flower placement. They also made an important observation about the seasonal distribution of the pollen. The species identified by Leroy Gourhan bloom at different times of the year. Yarrow and cornflower are summer flowers, while grape hyacinth blooms in the spring. If all the flowers had been gathered at the same time for a single burial ceremony, you would expect the pollen to come from plants that bloom in the same season. The fact that the pollen came from plants that bloom in different seasons was, the researchers argued, more consistent with the gradual accumulation of pollen through natural processes, such as rodent caching or bee activity, than with a single, deliberate act of flower placement. This is the nature of science. A beautiful story is told, and then other scientists test it, question it, examine it from every angle, looking for flaws and alternative explanations. And sometimes the beautiful story survives the testing intact, and sometimes it is modified, and sometimes it is replaced by a less beautiful but more accurate understanding. In the case of the Shanidar flower burial, the original story has been significantly complicated. The debate is not settled. There are still researchers who believe that the pollen evidence is best explained by deliberate flower placement. There are aspects of the pollen distribution that are difficult to fully account for by natural processes alone. But the confident certainty of Solecki's original interpretation has given way to something more tentative, more qualified, more honest about the limits of what the evidence can tell us. But here is what I want you to hold on to, the thing that remains true, regardless of how the flower debate is ultimately resolved. Even if the flowers were not placed by Neanderthal hands, even if every grain of pollen near Shanidar 4 was deposited by bees or jerds or the wind, it does not change the fundamental story of Shanidar Cave, because the flowers are only one small, though admittedly dramatic part of that story. The larger story, the story that does not depend on pollen analysis or rodent behaviour or the nesting habits of ground bees, is the story told by the bones themselves, and the bones are unambiguous. The bones of Nandy tell us that a severely disabled man was cared for over a period of many years by the people around him. The bones of Shanidar 3 tell us that a man with a near-fatal spear wound survived long enough for his body to begin healing, which means someone tended to him. The bones of Shanidar 5 tell us that a man with a serious head wound was allowed to recover fully. The bones tell us that these people looked after one another, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, but consistently, persistently, as a matter of course. Whether or not they also placed flowers on the graves of their dead, they undeniably, demonstrably, beyond any reasonable doubt, cared for their living. And that, in the end, is the more important story by far. Let me take you deeper now into the daily life of these people, because I think it helps to imagine their world in detail if we're going to truly understand what it meant for them to care for someone like Nandy. The act of caring seems simple from a distance, but when you understand the context, when you understand how hard their lives were and how much effort it took simply to survive from one day to the next, the caring becomes something extraordinary. The Zagros Mountains, 75,000 years ago, were not so different from the way they look today. The landscape was rugged and steep, with deep valleys cut by rivers and streams that ran down from the higher elevations. The vegetation was a mix of grasslands on the open slopes and sparse woodland in the valleys and on the lower hillsides, with stands of oak and pistachio and almond trees providing food for both humans and animals. The climate was colder than it is now, because this was during the last ice age, the Pleistocene, and even though the Zagros region was far south of the great ice sheets that covered much of northern Europe and North America, the temperatures were significantly lower and the winters were longer and harsher than anything the region experiences in the present day. Snow would have covered the higher slopes for months at a time, and the cold would have been a constant pressing reality, something that shaped every aspect of daily life. The Neanderthals who lived in Shanidar Cave were hunter-gatherers, which means they obtained their food entirely from the wild, from the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered. There was no farming, no agriculture, no domesticated animals. Everything they ate had to be found, caught, or collected from the landscape around them. The men, and possibly some of the women, hunted large animals. The mountains were home to wild goats, including the ibex, which is a spectacular climber capable of traversing nearly vertical rock faces, and the wild sheep, which grazed on the alpine meadows above the cave. In the valleys there were deer and wild boar, and occasionally something larger and far more dangerous like an aurochs. the enormous wild cattle that once roamed across much of Europe and the Middle East. An aurochs could weigh more than a ton, and its long curved horns could be deadly. Hunting such an animal with nothing but handheld spears was an act of extraordinary courage, coordination, and skill. They hunted with thrusting spears, heavy wooden shafts tipped with sharp stone points, made using a technique called mousterian, named after the site of Le Moustier in the Dordogne region of France, where this type of tool technology was first identified and described. Mousterian tools are the signature technology of the Neanderthals, and they are found at Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the mountains of Iran. The tools are made using a process called the Levallois technique, in which a stone core is carefully shaped and prepared so that a flake of a predetermined size and shape can be struck from it in a single controlled blow. The resulting flakes are thin, sharp, and versatile. They can be used as scrapers for working animal hides, as points for tipping spears, as blades for cutting meat and plant material, or as general-purpose tools for a wide variety of tasks. Making these tools was not simple. It required planning, spatial reasoning, fine motor control, and a thorough understanding of the properties of different types of stone. Different stones fracture differently. Flint and chert produce sharp, glassy edges. Obsidian is even sharper but more brittle. Quartzite is tougher but harder to work. A skilled toolmaker had to know which stone to use for which purpose, and had to be able to visualize the finished product inside the raw material before striking the first blow. This is a form of abstract thinking, and it tells us that Neanderthal cognition was far more sophisticated than Boole and his followers ever imagined. Let me say a bit more about the intelligence of these people, because I think it is important to understand just how capable they were if we are to appreciate the full significance of their compassion. There is a tendency, even now, even among people who have moved beyond the old Boole-era stereotypes, to think of Neanderthals as a lesser version of ourselves, as a rough draft that evolution subsequently improved upon. But the evidence from Shanidar and from dozens of other sites across Europe and the Middle East paints a different picture. The mousterian tool technology that the Shanidar Neanderthal used is itself evidence of considerable cognitive sophistication. The Levallois technique, which I mentioned earlier, is not something that can be learned by simple imitation. It requires the ability to hold a three-dimensional mental model of the desired end product and to work backward from that model through a series of preparatory steps, each of which must be executed in the correct order and with the correct amount of force. Experiments in which modern humans have been taught to make Levallois tools have shown that the process activates the same areas of the brain that are involved in planning, spatial reasoning, and language. This does not mean that making stone tools is the same as speaking, but it suggests that the cognitive foundations are shared, and that a species capable of the former might well have been capable of the latter. Beyond toolmaking, the Neanderthals of Shanidar showed evidence of other cognitively demanding behaviours. They used fire not just opportunistically but systematically, maintaining hearths over long periods and using fire for multiple purposes: cooking, warmth, light, protection, and hide processing. They organised their living space, creating distinct activity areas within the cave. They planned ahead, collecting raw materials for tools from sources that were sometimes many kilometres from the cave, which means they had a mental map of their territory and the ability to plan multi-day foraging trips. They prepared animal hides for use as clothing, a multi-step process that requires knowledge of materials, tools, and techniques. They buried their dead, which, whatever else it might signify, certainly indicates an awareness of death and a desire to respond to it in a structured, meaningful way. Some researchers have even argued that Neanderthals had a rudimentary aesthetic sense. At sites in Spain, manganese dioxide pigment, a black substance that can be used as a colorant, has been found in association with Neanderthal remains, suggesting that they may have used it for body painting or for decorating objects. Eagle talons and feathers have been found at Neanderthal sites, with cut marks that suggest they were removed from the birds deliberately, possibly for use as personal ornaments. These are not the behaviours of dim-witted brutes. These are the behaviours of thoughtful, capable, culturally complex beings who are fully adapted to their world and who had developed sophisticated strategies for surviving in it. And it is precisely this intelligence, this capacity for planning and empathy and social coordination that made the care of Nandy possible. A species of lesser cognitive ability might not have been able to sustain the kind of long-term, coordinated care that Nandy's survival required. It took intelligence to care for him. It took planning to ensure that he was fed every day, not just when someone remembered. It took empathy to understand his needs and anticipate his difficulties. It took social cohesion to maintain the group's commitment to his care over a period of years or decades, through good times and bad, through abundance and scarcity. The care of Nandy was not just an act of compassion, it was an act of intelligence, and it testifies to the cognitive richness of the Neanderthal mind. The women of the group, and probably the older children and the elderly as well, would have spent much of their time gathering plant foods. In the spring and summer, the mountain slopes around Shanidar Cave would have been rich with edible plants. There would have been wild onions and garlic growing in the rocky soil, their pungent smell filling the air. There would have been various species of grass whose seeds could be ground into a rough flour. There would have been berries and wild fruits, though probably less variety than in warmer climates. In the autumn there would have been nuts to collect, acorns and pistachios and almonds, which could be dried and stored for the lean winter months. And there would have been roots and tubers, starchy underground storage organs that plants used to survive the winter, which could be dug up with digging sticks and roasted in the fire to make them digestible. In the winter, the options would have been much more limited. The plants would have died back, the berries and fruits would have been long gone, and the group would have relied more heavily on stored food and on the meat from winter hunts. Winter was the hardest time. The cold was relentless, the days were short, and the game was scarce because many animals migrated to lower elevations or retreated into hibernation. This was when the group's cohesion and cooperation mattered most, when the sharing of food and warmth and labour was not just a social nicety, but a matter of survival. And this was when caring for someone like Nandy would have been most costly, because every piece of meat shared with him was a piece of meat that someone else did not eat, and every hour spent tending to him was an hour that could have been spent gathering firewood or preparing hides or hunting, and yet they did it, even in winter, even when resources were scarce, even when the cost was real and tangible. They kept the old man alive. Imagine Nandy in this world. Imagine him on a summer morning sitting near the cave entrance where the light is good, watching with his one clouded eye as the younger members of the group prepare for a hunt. He cannot go with them. He has not been able to go with them for years, perhaps decades. But he watches, and perhaps he remembers. Perhaps he remembers being young and strong and fast, before the rockfall or the cave bear or whatever it was that took his arm and his eye and his hearing. Perhaps he remembers the thrill of the hunt, the moment when the spear struck home, the rush of adrenaline and triumph. Or perhaps he does not remember. Perhaps memory fades in the same way that eyesight fades, gradually and mercifully, until the past is as dim and indistinct as the world seen through a cataract. We will never know, but we know he was there. We know he watched, and we know that when the hunters returned, whether they returned with meat or empty-handed, he was fed. Think about what this might have meant to him. Not in abstract terms, not in the language of anthropology or evolutionary psychology, but in simple, human terms. He was old and broken and dependent on others for everything, for food, for warmth, for guidance when his failing eye could not show him the path. He was living in a state of profound vulnerability, the kind of vulnerability that most of us fear more than death itself. And yet, he was not abandoned. He was not scorned. He was not pushed to the margins of the group and left to survive on scraps. He was fed. He was kept warm. He was, as far as the evidence can tell us, treated with something that looks very much like respect, or affection, or love. This matters. I want to say that again, because I think it is the heart of this whole story. This matters. Not just as a piece of archaeological evidence, not just as a data point in the ongoing scientific debate about Neanderthal cognition and social behaviour, but as a simple, irreducible fact about what it means to be a thinking, feeling creature in a world full of suffering. 75,000 years ago, in a cave in the mountains, someone was cared for. Someone who could not care for themselves was fed and warmed and protected by the people around them. And this was done not once, not as an exceptional act of heroism, but every day, for years, as a matter of course, as simply and naturally as breathing. If that is not love, then I do not know what love is. Let me tell you now about the fire, because the fire was at the centre of everything, and without the fire, none of this story would have been possible. We take fire for granted. We flip a switch, and the lights come on. We turn a dial and the stove heats up. We press a button and the furnace roars to life. But for the Neanderthals of Shanidar, fire was precious, irreplaceable, and maintaining it was one of the most important tasks of daily life. We know that Neanderthals used fire. The evidence is abundant and unambiguous. At Shanidar and at dozens of other Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists have found hearths, concentrations of charcoal and ash and burned bone that mark the places where fires were built and maintained. Some of these hearths show evidence of repeated use over long periods of time, suggesting that fires were kept burning continuously, or nearly so, rather than being lit anew each day. Keeping a fire going required a steady supply of fuel, which in the Zagros Mountains would have meant wood, probably oak and other hardwoods from the slopes below the cave, supplemented by animal dung and perhaps dried plant material. Someone had to gather this fuel, carry it to the cave, and feed it to the fire at regular intervals. This was work, real, physical, time-consuming work, and it had to be done every day, in every kind of weather, regardless of how tired or hungry or cold the person doing it might be. The fire provided warmth, which was essential for survival during the mountain winters. It provided light, which extended the usable hours of the day and allowed work to continue after sunset. It provided protection from predators, because most animals are afraid of fire and will not approach a camp where flames are burning. And it provided a means of cooking food, which was critically important because cooking makes meat and plant material easier to digest, kills parasites and bacteria, and unlocks nutrients that are not available in raw food. A cooked meal provides more calories than a raw one, and for people living on the edge of survival, those extra calories could make the difference between life and death. The fire was also, and this is perhaps its most important function, a gathering place. It was the social centre of the group, the place where people came together at the end of the day to eat, to rest, to tend to their tools, to interact with one another. In modern hunter-gatherer societies that have been studied by anthropologists, the campfire serves exactly this function. It is where stories are told, where disputes are settled, where plans are made, where children are taught, where courtship happens, where the social bonds that hold the group together are reinforced and renewed. There is every reason to think that the Neanderthal campfire served a similar purpose, and that the social life of the Shanidar community revolved around its fires, just as the social life of modern hunter-gatherers revolves around theirs. And there, at the fire, every evening, was Nandy, present, participating in the social life of the group in whatever way he could, connected to the people around him by the warmth of the flames, and whatever bonds of kinship and affection held them together. Now let us talk about communication, because this is another piece of the puzzle that is essential for understanding the Neanderthals of Shanidar, and it is one of the most debated topics in all of paleoanthropology. Did Neanderthals have language? Could they talk? The question is simple, but the answer is extraordinarily complicated. We do not know for certain whether Neanderthals had language in the full, complex sense that modern humans do, with grammar and syntax and vocabulary, and the ability to discuss abstract concepts and past events and hypothetical futures. Language does not fossilize. Words leave no trace in the earth. The conversations that took place around the campfire in Shanidar Cave 50,000 years ago are gone forever, dissipated into the air like smoke. But we can look for indirect evidence, and what we find is suggestive. First, there is the anatomical evidence. Neanderthals possessed a hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the muscles used in speech, and their hyoid bone was virtually identical to ours. This does not prove that they could speak, but it means that they had the basic anatomical equipment for it. Their ear canals were tuned to the same frequency range as ours, roughly 2 to 4 kHz, which is precisely the range that is most important for distinguishing the sounds of human speech. Again, this does not prove language, but it strongly suggests that Neanderthal ears were adapted to hear the same kinds of sounds that our ears are adapted to hear, including potentially speech sounds. Then there is the genetic evidence. We now know, thanks to the remarkable advances in ancient DNA extraction and sequencing that have occurred in the past 2 decades, that Neanderthals possessed a version of the FOXP2 gene, which in modern humans is associated with the fine motor control of the mouth, tongue, and larynx that is necessary for speech. Mutations in FOXP2 in modern humans cause severe speech and language disorders. The fact that Neanderthals had a functional version of this gene is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for Neanderthal language capacity, though it is not by itself conclusive. And then there is the behavioural evidence. and this is where the story of Shanidar becomes relevant to the language question. Consider what it would take to organise the kind of sustained group-level care that Nandy received. Someone had to decide that the old man would be fed. Someone had to coordinate the distribution of food so that Nandy received his share. Someone had to organise the logistics of moving camp while accommodating a member of the group who could barely walk. Someone had to tend to his injuries, to clean his wounds, to keep him warm. None of these things require language in the strict sense, but all of them would be much easier, much more efficient, and much more likely to be sustained over a long period of time if the group had some way of communicating about them in detail. Language, even a simple limited form of it, would have been an enormous advantage in coordinating the kind of care that the Shanidar evidence reveals. It is not proof, but it is a strong hint, and it adds yet another layer of complexity to our picture of who these people were. And beyond language, there is the question of what else the Neanderthals of Shanidar might have shared around their fires. We know from the study of modern hunter-gatherer societies that nighttime firelight conversations are qualitatively different from daytime interactions. Anthropologists who have studied the San people of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, and the Aboriginal Australians have found that daytime conversations tend to be practical, focused on the immediate tasks of survival: who will hunt where, what needs to be repaired, where the water sources are. But nighttime conversations, the ones that happen around the fire after the work of the day is done, tend to be different. They are more social, more reflective, more imaginative. This is when stories are told, when the exploits of past hunts are recounted with embellishment and drama, when the deeds of ancestors are remembered, when myths and legends are shared, when laughter and song fill the darkness beyond the firelight. We cannot know whether the Neanderthals of Shanidar told stories. We cannot know whether they sang or laughed or mourned out loud when someone died. These are the things that leave no trace in the earth, the ephemeral, intangible aspects of life that are the most important and the most impossible to preserve. But we can say this: they had the time for it. The evening hours, between the end of the day's work and the onset of sleep, would have been a significant portion of the day, especially in winter when the nights were long. And they had the social complexity for it. A group of 15 or 20 individuals living in close quarters, sharing food and labour and danger, would have had plenty to communicate about. There would have been social dynamics to manage, conflicts to resolve, alliances to maintain, mating relationships to negotiate, children to educate. All of these things require communication, and the more sophisticated the communication, the more effectively they can be managed. Perhaps Nandy, sitting by the fire in those long evening hours, was not just a passive recipient of care but an active participant in the social life of the group. Perhaps he communicated in ways that went beyond the simple exchange of practical information. Perhaps he was a source of comfort or wisdom or humour. Perhaps the younger members of the group sought him out not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because his presence was valued, because he had something to offer that was not measurable in calories or labour hours. We are speculating now, of course. The bones cannot tell us this. But the speculation is grounded in what we know about social animals and about the nature of group living, and it is not unreasonable. And it adds one more layer of possibility to our understanding of why Nandy was cared for, and what his life might have been like in those years by the fire. Now I want to bring us forward in time once more, to the 21st century, because there is one more discovery that I want to tell you about, and it is a discovery that shows how much we still have to learn from Shanidar Cave. In 2015, a team of archaeologists led by Graham Barker of the University of Cambridge returned to Shanidar. This was the first major excavation at the site since Solecki's work had ended in 1960, a gap of more than 50 years. The Cambridge team's goal was to apply modern archaeological techniques that Solecki could not have dreamed of, to the same layers of sediment that he had explored. They brought with them ground-penetrating radar, high-resolution photography, advanced radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA analysis, isotope studies, and a host of other tools that had been developed in the decades since Solecki's time. They wanted to see what the cave still had to tell, and what they found exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. In 2020, the team announced the discovery of a new Neanderthal skeleton, the first to be found at Shanidar in more than half a century. They designated it Shanidar Zed, and the story of its discovery and recovery is a testament to the patience and skill of modern archaeology, The skeleton was found in the same area of the cave where Solecki had found his burials, in a layer of sediment that had been partially but not fully excavated during the original dig. The remains were those of an adult, likely female based on the size and robustness of the bones, and the skull had been completely crushed by the immense weight of the sediment that had accumulated above it over tens of thousands of years. It was flattened to a thickness of roughly 2 centimeters, about the thickness of a pizza box lid, and the bone had fragmented into hundreds of tiny pieces that were scattered across a small area of the cave floor, like a jigsaw puzzle that had been stepped on and then buried. Piecing that skull back together was one of the most challenging conservation tasks in the history of Neanderthal research. The fragments were tiny, many of them smaller than a fingernail, and they were embedded in hard, compacted sediment that had to be removed with the finest of tools under magnification. The work was done not in the cave itself, but in a laboratory at Cambridge, where the conservators could work in controlled conditions with the right equipment. It took months of painstaking, meticulous labour, but when the skull was finally reconstructed, it was a revelation. It revealed the face of a Neanderthal woman who had lived and died in Shanidar Cave, in the same community, during roughly the same period as Nandy and the others. Her face was broad, with heavy brow ridges and a wide nose, typical of Neanderthal anatomy, and the position in which she'd been found told its own story. Shanidar Z had been placed in what appeared to be a deliberately dug channel, or hollow in the cave floor. Her upper body was propped against one side of this channel, and her head was resting on what seemed to be a kind of pillow or cushion of earth. Her left hand was tucked beneath her head, as though she had been arranged to look as though she was sleeping, or as though someone had wanted to make sure she was comfortable even in death. This was not a body that had been carelessly discarded or that had simply fallen where it lay. This was a body that had been positioned with deliberate care and attention. The discovery of Shanidar Z was significant for several reasons beyond the skeleton itself. First, it confirmed that the practice of burying the dead at Shanidar was not limited to a single individual or a single event. Multiple burials spread across an area of the cave suggested a sustained, repeated practice, a tradition, if you will. Second, Shanidar Z was found very close to Shanidar 4, the famous flower burial, which raised the tantalizing possibility that the Neanderthals of Shanidar had a designated burial area within the cave, a specific part of their home that was set aside for the dead. If true, this represents a level of spatial organization, symbolic thinking, and forward planning that goes far beyond what was once thought possible for Neanderthals. And third, the Cambridge team found new pollen evidence in the sediment near Shanidar Z. This pollen is currently being analysed with modern techniques that are far more precise and discriminating than anything available in Leroy Gourhan's time. The results of this analysis may help to resolve, one way or another, the decades-old debate about whether the Shanidar Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers. If the new pollen shows distribution patterns that cannot be explained by bee activity or rodent caching, it would powerfully support the flower burial theory. If not, it would further strengthen the naturalistic explanation. Either way, the science will be better for it. Let me tell you now about the other sites where Neanderthal burials have been found, because Shanidar does not stand alone. It is one of a growing number of locations across Europe and the Middle East, where evidence of Neanderthal mortuary behaviour has been discovered, and placing it in this broader context helps us understand just how significant it is. I mentioned La Chapelle-aux-Saints earlier, the site in France where the old man was found in 1908, but there are many others. La Ferracie, also in France, in the Dordogne region, is one of the most important Neanderthal burial sites ever discovered. Excavations there, beginning in the early 20th century and continuing intermittently ever since, have revealed the remains of at least 7 Neanderthal individuals, including adults and children. The burials at La Ferracie show clear evidence of deliberate interment. The bodies were placed in pits that had been dug into the cave floor, and the positions of the bodies suggest that they were arranged with care. One of the most poignant discoveries at La Ferracie was the burial of a very young child, an infant or perhaps a toddler. The child's body had been placed in a small pit, barely large enough to hold it, and covered with earth. Above the burial, a large flat stone slab had been placed like a cover or a marker, and on the underside of this slab, facing down toward the buried child, small cup-shaped depressions had been carved into the rock, shallow little hollows arranged in a rough pattern. Some researchers believe these marks were deliberately made, perhaps as some kind of symbolic or decorative element associated with the burial. If so, they represent some of the earliest known examples of Neanderthal symbolic behaviour, marks made with intent and meaning, art in its most primitive form, associated with the death and burial of a child. Others are more cautious, pointing out that similar depressions can sometimes occur naturally through geological processes. Beyond the evidence from burial sites, there are other tantalizing hints of Neanderthal symbolic and cultural behaviour that help to fill in the picture. At the site of Bruniquel in southern France, deep inside a cave, researchers have found a series of circular structures built from broken stalagmites. The structures are roughly 176,000 years old, far older than any modern human presence in Europe, and they are located more than 300 metres from the cave entrance, in total darkness, which means that whoever built them had to carry fire deep into the cave to light their way. The purpose of these structures is unknown. They do not appear to be practical shelters or storage areas. Some researchers have speculated that they served a ritual or symbolic function, a gathering place for activities that we can only guess at. If so, they represent evidence of Neanderthal symbolic thinking that predates even the earliest Shanidar burials by more than 100,000 years. At other sites, Neanderthals have been found to have collected unusual or aesthetically interesting objects, crystals, fossils, oddly shaped stones, items that have no obvious practical value, but that might have been valued for their beauty or their strangeness. These are small hints, fragments of a picture that we may never see in full. But they suggest a species that was capable of thinking beyond the immediate demands of survival, a species that could wonder, that could appreciate beauty, that could create meaning in a world that offered none by default. And this is the broader context in which the compassion shown to Nandy should be understood. It was not an isolated act of kindness in an otherwise blank and meaningless existence. It was one expression of a rich and complex inner life, a life that included tool-making and fire-tending and burial, and perhaps art and perhaps ritual, and perhaps, in its own way, philosophy. But the placement of the slab, directly over a child's burial, with the marks facing down toward the body, is suggestive of something more than coincidence. There are other sites too. Iraqi Cave in Israel contained the burial of a Neanderthal man, whose body had been placed in a pit and covered with soil. Amud Cave, also in Israel, contained the skeleton of a Neanderthal infant who appeared to have been buried with a piece of red deer jaw, placed on or near the body. Teshik Tash in Uzbekistan contained the burial of a Neanderthal child, surrounded by pairs of ibex horns. Each of these sites adds to the picture, and the picture that emerges is one of the species that treated its dead with consistent, repeated, deliberate respect, across a wide geographic range and over a long period of time. This was not a local custom practiced by one group. This was a widespread behaviour, a shared tradition, something that seems to have been part of what it meant to be a Neanderthal. The pattern that emerges from all of these sites, from Shanidar and La Chapelle-aux-Saints and La Ferracie and Kebara and Ahmed and all the others, is one of consistent, repeated, deliberate care for the dead and the disabled. Neanderthals buried their dead. Neanderthals cared for their injured and their elderly. Neanderthals lived in social groups that were bound together by something deeper than the mere instinct to survive. They were bound by what we might call, without any hesitation or qualification, love. This is where I want to slow down for a moment and let the quiet settle around you, because I think what we have been talking about deserves a moment of stillness. We live in a world that moves very fast, a world of noise and urgency and constant stimulation, a world that often encourages us to think of the past as a place of darkness and ignorance, a primitive prelude to the enlightened present. But the story of Shanidar reminds us that some of the most important things about being human, the things we value most, the things that give our lives meaning and purpose, are not modern inventions. They are very, very old. The impulse to care for someone who is suffering, to sit beside them and hold their hand and bring them food, this is not something we invented. The impulse to bury the dead with respect, to mark the place where they lie, to create some kind of ritual or ceremony around the moment of passing, this is not something that began with civilization or religion. The impulse to gather flowers and place them where a loved one lies, whether or not the Shanidar Neanderthals actually did this, the impulse itself is ancient and universal and deep. These things are part of us. They have always been part of us, and the Neanderthals, who were not our species but who are our closest relatives, who shared with us a common ancestor deep in the African past, who walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and who vanished from it roughly 40,000 years ago for reasons that we still do not fully understand, They felt these things too. They felt what we feel. They did what we do. They were in every way that truly counts, like us. Let me return now to the cave, one last time, because I want to try to imagine what the final days of Nandy's life might have been like. We do not know the exact circumstances of his death. The bones, eloquent as they are, cannot tell us everything. They cannot tell us whether he died in winter or summer, quickly or slowly, in pain or in peace. But we can make some reasonable guesses based on what we know about Neanderthal life and about the injuries that Nandy carried with him for all those years. He was old, as I have said many times now, perhaps 40 or 45 years of age, which in Neanderthal terms was very old indeed, ancient by the standards of a species whose average life expectancy was probably somewhere in the mid-20s to early 30s. Most Neanderthals did not live to see 40. The physical demands of their way of life, the constant exposure to cold and injury and infection, the high caloric requirements of maintaining a powerful muscular body in a harsh climate, all of these factors conspired to keep lifespans short. Nandy had outlived most of the people he'd grown up with. He had seen companions die and been present when they were buried. He had watched the composition of the group change around him over the decades, younger faces replacing older ones, children growing into adults, new alliances and relationships forming as the social fabric of the community shifted and evolved. And through all of it, through all the changes and all the losses, he had remained. A constant presence, a living connection to the group's past, perhaps the oldest member of the community, perhaps the only one who remembered certain things, certain events, certain places, certain people who were now gone. And then, one day, the end came. Perhaps it was gentle. Perhaps Nandy simply did not wake up one morning, his old, battered heart finally giving out during the night, his last breath leaving him so quietly that the person sleeping next to him did not even notice until the morning fire was built, and the warmth did not rouse him. Or perhaps it was slower, a gradual decline over days or weeks, a fever perhaps, or simply the slow shutdown of a body that had endured too much for too long. Perhaps he lay near the fire while the group went about its daily business, and they brought him water and food and sat with him when they could, and watched as the light slowly left his one remaining eye, and knew that the old man who had been a part of their lives for as long as they could remember was leaving them. However it happened, when it was over, they buried him. They laid him in the earth inside the cave, in the place that had been his home for his entire life, the same cave where he had been born, where he had grown up, where he had hunted before his injuries, where he had sat by the fire for all those long years afterward. They placed him in the ground and they covered him with soil, and then they went on with their lives. Because that is what the living do. They go on. They hunt and gather and make tools and raise children and argue and reconcile and laugh and grieve and sit by fires and talk, or whatever Neanderthals did in place of talking, and they carry the memory of the dead with them for as long as memory lasts. And then the memory fades too, and the generations turn over, and new people are born who never knew the old ones, and eventually even the cave itself grows quiet, and the sediment accumulates, and the bones are buried deeper and deeper beneath the slow, patient weight of time. And they did not know, of course they did not know, but we know. And what Ralph Solecki would find when he came to this cave 50,000 years later would be something that still has the power to change the way you think about what it means to be human. That young man from Columbia University would come to their cave with his shovels and brushes and carefully remove the earth from around those ancient bones, and would be so moved by what he found that he would spend the rest of his career telling the world about it. Solecki himself lived a long and productive life. He continued to write and lecture about Shanidar for decades after the excavations ended, and he remained a passionate advocate for a more nuanced understanding of Neanderthals until the very end of his career. He was not always popular among his colleagues. Some found his interpretations too romantic, too willing to attribute human-like emotions and behaviours to a species that was not technically human. The flower burial in particular attracted criticism from researchers who felt that the evidence did not support such a dramatic conclusion. But Solecki never wavered in his conviction that the Neanderthals of Shanidar were beings of depth and complexity, capable of love and grief and ritual. He had held Nandy's bones in his hands. He had felt the smooth stump of the amputated arm. He had traced the fracture lines of the crushed orbit with his fingertips. He knew, in the way that only someone who has spent weeks in intimate contact with another person's remains can know, that this individual had been cared for, that his survival was not a fluke of biology, but a testament to the devotion of the people around him, and that knowledge, that certainty born of direct physical encounter with the evidence, was something that no amount of academic skepticism could shake. Solecki's wife, Rose, who had accompanied him on some of his expeditions to Kurdistan and who shared his passion for the Shanidar discoveries, was also instrumental in bringing the story to a wider audience. Together, they worked to ensure that the significance of Shanidar was not lost in the dry language of academic journals, but was communicated to the general public in terms that anyone could understand. Their efforts were largely successful. The story of Nandy, the flower burial, the picture of Neanderthals as compassionate, caring beings, all of these ideas entered the popular consciousness and helped to reshape the public image of our closest evolutionary relatives. Solecki died in 2019 at the age of 101, having lived to see many of his most controversial ideas vindicated by subsequent research. He didn't live quite long enough to see the discovery of Shanidar Cave, which was announced the following year, but he knew that the Cambridge team had returned to the cave, and he expressed his delight and his hope that they would find new evidence to add to the story he had spent his life telling. In a sense, Solecki's relationship with Nandy was itself a kind of care across time, a commitment to understanding and honouring a life that had ended 50,000 years before his own began. He spent decades advocating for a man he'd never met, a man whose name he had invented, a man who had been dead for longer than any civilization has existed. And in doing so, he demonstrated the same quality that he attributed to the Neanderthals themselves, the willingness to devote time and energy and passion to someone who cannot repay you simply because it is the right thing to do. They did not know that a French scientist named Arlette Leroy-Gourhan would examine the soil and find pollen and propose that flowers had been laid with the dead. They did not know that Eric Trinkas would study the damage to Nandy's bones and conclude, in his careful, scientific way, that someone had loved this man. They didn't know that Graham Barker would return to the cave half a century later and find another one of their people, a woman with a crushed skull, laid to rest with her hand under her head like a sleeper. They did not know any of this, and they did not need to know. They did not care for Nandy because they wanted to be remembered. They did not bury their dead because they wanted scientists to find the graves. They did these things because it was who they were, because it was what they did, because the impulse to care for the suffering and to honour the dead was as deep and as natural to them as breathing, or hunger, or the warmth of a fire on a cold night. I want to spend these last few minutes thinking with you about what all of this means, not just for our understanding of Neanderthals, but for our understanding of ourselves. Because I think the story of Shanidar has something to teach us that goes beyond archaeology and paleoanthropology and the details of pollen analysis. I think it has something to teach us about who we are and what we are capable of and what, in the deepest and most fundamental sense, makes a life worth living. We live in a culture that often values people for what they can produce, for their usefulness, for their economic contribution, for their ability to keep up with the pace of modern life. We live in a culture that sometimes struggles with the question of what to do with people who cannot contribute in the ways that our society rewards, people who are old or disabled or sick, or simply different in ways that make conventional productivity difficult. The story of Shanidar offers a different model. It offers a model that is 75,000 years old, a model in which the value of a person is not measured by their productivity, but by their membership in the community, a model in which the old and the disabled and the broken are not discarded but are cared for, not because it is efficient or economically rational, but because it is right, because they are one of us, because that is what we do. The story of Shanidar has had an impact that extends far beyond the world of archaeology and paleoanthropology. It has influenced how we think about disability, about aging, about the nature of community, and about what we owe to one another as social beings. When Solecki published his findings, and particularly when the flower burial became widely known, it sparked a conversation that is still ongoing today, a conversation about the origins of empathy and the evolutionary roots of what we now call social responsibility. Medical ethicists have pointed to Nandy as one of the earliest known examples of what they call the duty of care, the moral obligation to provide assistance to those who cannot help themselves. This is a concept that underlies much of modern medicine, social work and disability rights, and its roots, as Shanidar shows us, go back far deeper than we might have imagined. The story has also influenced the way we think about aging and the value of elderly members of society. In many modern cultures, Old age is associated with declining value, with uselessness, with being a burden on the young and productive. The economics of healthcare and elder care are often discussed in terms of cost and efficiency, as though the value of a human being can be measured in dollars and productivity. But the story of Nandy reminds us that there is another way of seeing things. In his community, old age was not a liability to be managed, but a life to be supported. The old and the injured were not problems to be solved, but people to be cared for, and the care itself was a source of strength for the whole group, a demonstration of the values that held them together. Anthropologists and psychologists have used the Shanidar evidence to argue that compassion is not a luxury, not something that societies develop only when they have surplus resources to spare, but a fundamental component of social life that is present even under the harshest conditions. The Neanderthals of Shanidar were not living in abundance. They were living on the edge of survival, in a cold and dangerous environment, with limited technology and no safety net beyond their own solidarity. And yet they found the resources to care for Nandy. This suggests that compassion is not something we do when we can afford to. It is something we do because we must, because it is woven into the fabric of social life itself, because a group that abandons its vulnerable members is a group that has lost something essential, something that holds it together and gives it meaning. The implications of this insight extend into the modern world in ways that are both profound and practical. When we debate the proper level of care for the elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill, we are debating in a sense the same question that the people of Shanidar answered 75,000 years ago, and their answer was unequivocal. We care for our own. The cost is real, and we bear it, because that is what it means to be part of a group, part of a family, part of a community. The alternative, the abandonment of the weak, is not an option we are willing to consider. This is, I believe, the most enduring legacy of Shanidar, more enduring even than the flower burial, more enduring than the pollen debate, more enduring than the reconstruction of Shanidar Z's crushed skull. It is the simple, incontrovertible fact that 75,000 years ago a group of people who we once dismissed as brutes looked at a man who could not survive on his own and said, without words perhaps, but with every action, every meal shared, every cold night warmed, you are one of us and we will take care of you. This is not a sentimental interpretation. This is what the evidence shows. Nandy was not productive. He could not hunt. He could not make tools effectively. He could not gather food or carry loads or do any of the physical tasks that kept the group alive. And yet he was kept alive for decades at significant cost to the group, because the people around him simply could not or would not let him die. That decision, that refusal to abandon, is one of the oldest moral choices in the human record. And it is still being made today, every time someone sits by the bedside of a dying parent, or feeds a child who cannot feed itself, or carries a friend through a crisis that seems endless. The details change, the world changes, but the choice remains the same. We're coming now to the very end of this story, and I want the ending to be quiet, because quiet endings are the ones that stay with you. Let me paint one more picture for you before we reach the very end, because I want you to carry this image with you as you drift towards sleep. It is a picture of an ordinary night in Shanidar Cave, a night when nothing special happened, a night like 10,000 other nights that came before and 10,000 that came after. The sun has set behind the western ridge of mountains, and the sky above the valley has turned from gold to purple to the deep, clear blue-black of a mountain night. The first stars are appearing, faint at first, then brighter as the last light fades, and soon the sky is filled with them, more stars than you have ever seen, because there are no cities, no streetlights, no electric glow of any kind to dim their brilliance. The Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light, and the constellations, the ones we know, and the ones that existed then but have since drifted apart, turn slowly overhead as the earth rotates beneath them. And if you are still here, still listening, still drifting gently between waking and sleep, then stay just a little longer, because the quietest and most beautiful part of this story is almost here. Inside the cave, the fire is burning steadily. Someone has added a thick piece of oak to the flames, and it is burning slowly, throwing off a steady, generous heat and a warm, flickering light that reaches into the corners of the cave and dances on the walls. The smell of smoke and cooked meat and animal hides, and the earthy, mineral scent of the cave itself mingle together in the warm air. The group is settling down for the night. The hunters are tired from a long day on the mountain slopes, and the gatherers are tired from hours of walking and digging and carrying. The children have been fed and are already drowsing, their small bodies curled together like a litter of puppies, warm and safe and utterly trusting in the way that only children can be. The adults are finishing the last tasks of the day. Someone is scraping a hide that has been stretched on a frame near the fire, working it with a stone scraper to make it soft and supple. Someone else is knapping a piece of flint, the sharp, rhythmic tapping of stone on stone filling the quiet cave with a sound that is both industrious and soothing. A woman is nursing an infant, her back against the cave wall, her eyes half closed. The baby's quiet, suckling the only sound she makes. And Nandy is there, in his usual place by the fire, his legs folded beneath him, his one hand resting on his knee, his dim eye watching the flames. He is warm. He has been fed. The pain in his legs and his stump is a dull, familiar ache that he has long since learned to ignore or at least to endure. He's not thinking about the future because the concept of the future, as we understand it, may not exist for him. He's not thinking about the past, or if he is, the memories are dim and formless, more sensation than narrative. He's simply here, in this moment, in this cave, by this fire, among these people who are his people, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Outside the cave, the night is deep and still. The stars are scattered across the sky in patterns that have no names yet, patterns that will not be named for another 75,000 years. The mountains are dark shapes against a darker sky, and the wind moves through the valley of the Great Zab, carrying with it the scent of earth and stone and cold, clean water. Somewhere in the valley a night bird calls, a single, clear note that rises and fades and is answered after a long pause by another. The river moves through the darkness below, as it has always moved, as it will always move, carrying the water down from the mountain springs to the lowlands and from the lowlands to the distant sea, the same water, or almost the same water, that moved through this valley when Nandy was alive. Inside the cave, the fire has burned low. The flames are gone now, replaced by a bed of embers that glow a deep, steady red, like the heart of the earth itself. The smoke has thinned to a pale, barely visible thread that rises toward the ceiling and disappears. The cave is warm, or warm enough, and quiet. The people are sleeping, curled together under their furs and hides, the way families sleep on cold nights, close enough to share warmth, close enough to feel the breathing of the person beside them. A child murmurs in sleep and is quieted by a hand that moves, almost without waking, to rest on the child's back. An older woman shifts position and sighs. Someone in the back of the cave coughs softly and is still. And there, near the embers, in the last faint glow of the dying fire, lies the place where Nandy once sat. He is gone now. He has been gone for a long time, buried in the earth a few steps away, in the part of the cave where they put their dead. The place where he sat has been taken by someone else, or perhaps it has been left empty, a kind of memorial that no one has to explain because everyone understands. And the group goes on. They will go on for thousands of years more, these Neanderthals, these quiet, strong, compassionate people, living in their caves and hunting on their mountains and caring for their sick and burying their dead, until one day, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, they will vanish from the earth, the last of their kind dying somewhere in the mountains of southern Spain or the rock shelters of Gibraltar, roughly 40,000 years ago, leaving behind nothing but their bones and their tools and the faint chemical trace of their pollen and the story, the extraordinary, moving, irreducible story of what they did for one another while they were here. There is a sadness that underlies this story, a sadness that goes beyond the individual tragedies of injured bones and early deaths. It is the sadness of extinction. The Neanderthals are gone. They vanished from the earth roughly 40,000 years ago, after having lived on it for more than 300,000 years, far longer than our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed so far. Their disappearance coincided with the arrival and expansion of modern humans into Europe and Western Asia, and while the exact relationship between these two events is still debated, the most widely accepted theory is that the Neanderthals were unable to compete successfully with the newcomers for resources and territory. Modern humans, it seems, had certain advantages, perhaps in technology, perhaps in social organization, perhaps in language, perhaps in sheer numbers, that allowed them to gradually displace the Neanderthals from their habitats, pushing them into smaller and more marginal territories until, eventually, the last small populations dwindled and died out. But the Neanderthals did not vanish entirely without a trace. We now know, thanks to the revolution in ancient DNA analysis that has occurred in the past 2 decades, that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. Not frequently, and not everywhere, but enough that most people of non-African descent today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This is a remarkable fact, and it means that the Neanderthals are not, in a genetic sense, completely extinct. They live on in us, in fragments of DNA that have been passed down through thousands of generations, contributing to everything from our immune systems to our skin and hair to our susceptibility to certain diseases. When you look in the mirror, you are, in a very small but very real sense, looking at a Neanderthal, and this genetic legacy adds another dimension to the story of Shanidar, because it means that the people who lived in that cave, the people who cared for Nandy and buried their dead and may have laid flowers on a grave, were not alien beings from a separate branch of life. They were our relatives. They were our cousins, close enough to us genetically that we could interbreed and produce fertile offspring. The distance between us and them, which once seemed vast and unbridgeable, has shrunk with every new discovery to something much smaller and more intimate. They were different from us, yes. Their bodies were different, stockier and more muscular, built for cold climates and close-quarters combat with large prey. Their brains were shaped differently, and they may have processed information in ways that were subtly different from the way we do. Their technology, while sophisticated, did not advance at the same pace as the technology of modern humans, but they loved, they grieved, they helped their injured, they buried their dead, and in the end they left a piece of themselves inside us, a genetic echo that persists to this day. What might they have become, these people, if history had gone differently? If modern humans had never left Africa, or had taken a different route, or had arrived in Europe and the Middle East a few thousand years later, giving the Neanderthals more time? It is a question that cannot be answered, of course, but it is worth asking, because it reminds us that the history of our species is not a story of inevitable triumph. It is a story of contingency, of chance encounters, and narrow margins and paths not taken. The Neanderthals were here for a very long time, and they built lives of complexity and meaning and compassion, and then they were gone. What remains are their bones, their tools, their pollen, and the stories we tell about them, stories like this one, told 75,000 years after the fact, in a language they would not have understood, to an audience they could not have imagined, by someone who will never know their names but who is moved, as Solecki was moved, as Trinkhaus was moved, as Barker and his team are moved, by the simple, astonishing fact of their compassion. 75,000 years is a very long time. It is so long that the mind cannot really grasp it. If you tried to count to 75,000, one number per second, it would take you nearly 21 hours, and that is just the number of years, not the days, which number in the billions, or the moments which are beyond all counting. In all that time the seasons have turned and turned again. The snow has fallen and melted on the slopes of Bradost Mountain. The great Zab has carved its valley a fraction of an inch deeper. The oaks and pistachios have grown and died and been replaced by their offspring, and the cave has sat there, silent and dark, keeping its secrets beneath the slow, patient accumulation of dust and earth and time. But some things endure. Some things are the same now as they were then. The need to be close to another person, the need to be warm, the need to know that if you fall, someone will be there to help you up, the need to know that when you are gone, someone will remember, or at the very least, that someone will lay you in the earth with care. These needs are older than language, they are older than art, they are older than music and religion and writing and everything else that we call civilization. They are as old as the mountains, as old as the rivers, as old as the caves where the first fires were built, and the first injured companion was carried to safety, and the first grieving parent dug a small hole in the earth and placed inside it the body of a child who would never grow up. They are part of who we are. They are perhaps the most important part of who we are, and they will endure long after we're gone, just as they endured long after Nandy was gone, carried forward by whatever creatures come after us, whoever they are, whatever they become. Before you drift off tonight, if you have enjoyed this journey through the ancient past, perhaps you might consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. There is no urgency at all. You can do it in the morning if you remember. For now, just let yourself rest. Sleep now if sleep is ready for you. Let the darkness come. Let the fire burn low. Let the cave grow quiet, as it has been quiet for 75,000 years. Patient and enduring, holding its stories in the earth, waiting for someone to listen. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you can carry with you the knowledge that 75,000 years ago, in a cave in the mountains of a country we now call Iraq, someone was loved.